The history of World War II is full of tragedies and heroic deeds. Millions of fates intertwined in this global conflict that changed the course of human civilization. However, among all these countless stories, there is one that stands out for its incredible absurdity and profound human dimension. This is the story of a man who fought for 3 different armies, wore 3 different uniforms, and fought on 3 different fronts. Not by his own choice, not out of ideological convictions, but by the will of fate, which threw him from one camp to another like a chip in an ocean storm. This is the story of Yang Kyoungjong, a Korean soldier who became a living witness to the absurdity of war and the helplessness of an ordinary person in the face of historical catastrophes. His path led through the armies of the Japanese Empire, the Soviet Union, and Nazi Germany. 3 ideologies, 3 languages, 3 worlds, and all this was experienced by one man who simply wanted to survive. His story is not a tale of heroism in the traditional sense. It is a story of survival, of how an ordinary person can become a hostage to great empires and their ambitions. Yang Kyoungjong was born in 1920 on the Korean peninsula under Japanese colonial rule. Korea had been annexed by the Japanese Empire in 1910, and for young Yang, this meant being a second-class citizen in his own country. The occupation was brutal. Koreans were forced to adopt Japanese names, speak Japanese, and serve the empire that had conquered them. By the time Yang turned 18, young Koreans were being massively mobilized. In 1938, Yang found himself in Manchuria, a vast region in northeastern China that Japan had transformed into the puppet state of Manchukuo. It was here, in the cold steppes far from home, that his incredible odyssey began. Young Koreans living in Manchuria were subjected to forced mobilization into the Japanese army. They had no choice. Refusal meant arrest, torture, or death for the entire family. Yang Kyoungjong was forcibly conscripted into the Kwantung Army, the strongest and most prestigious unit of the Japanese armed forces. For Yang, it meant fighting for an empire that had enslaved his homeland. Military training was brutal. Korean conscripts were subjected to particularly harsh treatment. Yang quickly understood the basic rules of survival. Don't stand out, follow orders without question, and silently endure any humiliation. This was his first lesson in the art of survival, a lesson that would save his life in the future. In 1939, a large-scale military conflict broke out between Japan and the Soviet Union on the border between Manchuria and Mongolia. The Battle of Khalkhin Gol raged from May to September 1939, one of the fiercest battles before World War II in Europe. More than 100,000 soldiers, over 1,000 tanks and aircraft, tens of thousands killed and wounded. The young Korean did not understand what he was fighting for. Japanese officers shouted about the greatness of the empire, but for Yang, these were empty words. He fought not out of conviction, but out of fear. The battle was a nightmare. Soviet forces under General Georgy Zhukov employed massive tank attacks, the likes of which the Japanese had never seen. On August 31st, 1939, the Japanese army suffered a crushing defeat. Thousands of soldiers were taken prisoner, among them was Yang Kyoungjong. For Soviet military personnel, Yang was simply another Japanese soldier. No one was interested in his nationality. He was the enemy, and that was enough. The Soviet command decided to send Japanese prisoners to labor camps in Siberia. The journey was agonizing. Prisoners were transported in freight cars packed to capacity. Those who survived entered a world that was like hell on earth. The Siberian labor camp was a realm of eternal cold, hunger, and backbreaking labor. Winter temperatures dropped to -40 degrees. Prisoners received thin clothing and torn shoes. The ration was barely enough to survive. Work was exhausting. Cutting timber, building roads, extracting minerals from dawn to dusk. Yang learned to survive. He learned to divide his tiny ration to last all day, to sleep in the cold, pressing against other prisoners for warmth, to work steadily enough to meet quotas without attracting attention. Years in the camp changed him from a young man into an emaciated but incredibly resilient survivor. On June 22, 1941, Nazi Germany attacked the Soviet Union. By 1942, the Red Army desperately needed new soldiers. Soviet command made a pragmatic decision: offer prisoners of war a chance at redemption. Those who agreed to fight for the USSR could leave the camps and receive a rifle. For Yang, the choice was obvious. He had no illusions about his chances, but at least at the front, there was hope. Soon, Yang put on a new uniform, the uniform of a Red Army soldier. He became a soldier of the very army that had taken him prisoner 3 years earlier. Military training was brief and brutal. Soviet instructors did not trust former prisoners of war. Yang understood he was trapped again. He was not fighting for ideology or homeland. He was fighting for the right to continue breathing. This was his second lesson in survival: adapt or die. In 1943, Yang participated in the Third Battle of Kharkov, one of the bloodiest battles of the Eastern Front. In February 1943, Field Marshal von Manstein organized a brilliant counteroffensive. German tank divisions dealt a crushing blow to Soviet lines. Tens of thousands of soldiers were killed or captured. Among the prisoners was Yang Kyoungjong. For the second time in his life, he found himself in captivity, now in German hands. For German soldiers, this prisoner was a mystery. His Asian appearance contrasted sharply with typical Soviet soldiers. German officers quickly made a pragmatic decision: if he can hold a rifle, he can fight. By 1943, Germany experienced an acute shortage of personnel. Thus appeared the Ostbataillon, Eastern battalions formed from Soviet prisoners of war. Yang Kyoungjong was enrolled in one of these battalions. He was issued a German uniform, a German Mauser 98K rifle, and sent for training. Now he was to fight for the Third Army of his life. At the end of 1943, Yang's battalion was sent to France. German command was strengthening the defense of the French coast against a possible Allied invasion. For Yang, France was yet another unfamiliar world. From the cold steppes of Manchuria to icy Siberian camps, from the Eastern Front to the French coast, his journey was incredible and tragic. On June 6, 1944, Operation Overlord began, the largest amphibious operation in human history. More than 150,000 Allied soldiers landed on the beaches of Normandy. Yang Kyoungjong once again found himself in military chaos, this time in a German uniform, on French soil, fighting against American soldiers. The absurdity was obvious, but he had no choice. The Battle of Normandy was hell. Allied artillery and aviation methodically destroyed German positions. Several days after the invasion began, Yang's position was captured by American paratroopers. For the third time in his life, he found himself in captivity. American soldiers were amazed when they saw an Asian man in a German uniform among the prisoners. Through a Japanese interpreter, the basic facts of his incredible story were established. A Korean conscripted into the Japanese army, taken prisoner by Soviets, mobilized into the Red Army, captured by Germans, and recruited into the Wehrmacht. The story seemed so incredible that some officers initially did not believe it. A military photographer took a picture of Yang shortly after his capture. This photograph captured an emaciated Asian man in a German uniform with deep exhaustion on his face. His eyes looked into the distance, as if seeing something inaccessible to others. This photograph subsequently became one of the most famous images of World War II, embodying the absurdity of war and its ability to grind human lives. After capture, Yang was sent to a British prisoner of war camp, then transferred to the United States, where he remained until the end of the war. For a man who had survived Siberian camps and front lines of several wars, American camps were relatively comfortable. Yang slowly recovered physically and psychologically, though years of war had left deep scars in his soul. On May 8, 1945, Germany capitulated. On September 2nd, Japan capitulated. World War II ended. Millions began returning home. But for Yang Kyoungjong, returning home was impossible. Korea was divided. The North controlled by the Soviet Union, the South by the United States. A man who had served in Japanese, Soviet, and German armies could find no place in either Korea. Yang made the decision to stay in the United States. In 1947, he received permission to reside in America. He settled in Illinois, in a small Midwest town. He got a simple job and lived quietly. Neighbors remembered him as a quiet, polite man who kept to himself. He learned basic English, but almost never spoke about his past. Sometimes neighbors saw him standing at the window for long periods, looking into the distance. Perhaps he remembered Korea, which he had left as a young man and would never see again. Perhaps he thought about comrades who did not survive. Perhaps he simply enjoyed the peace he had been denied for most of his life. Yang never married and never started a family. War had taken not only his youth, but also his ability for intimacy and trust. He lived the rest of his life alone, but this solitude was his choice, his way of coping with the past. Yang Kyoungjong died in 1992 at the age of 72. The funeral was modest. His grave is in an ordinary American cemetery, without lavish monuments. For most people, he remained just another immigrant who lived quietly far from his homeland. But several years later, his story became known worldwide. That photograph taken in Normandy in June 1944 appeared in a historical study. Historians reconstructed the amazing biography of the man in the picture. The story of Yang Kyoungjong quickly spread around the world. It was so incredible that, if fictional, it would have been considered too implausible. But it was true, a terrifying, absurd, tragic truth about how war throws human lives from side to side. His story became a symbol of millions whose destinies were crippled by war, a symbol of Koreans who suffered under Japanese colonial rule, a symbol of all those forced to fight in wars that were not their wars, for causes that were not their causes. Yang's story reminds us that behind every military uniform stands a living person with hopes, fears, and dreams. That war makes no distinction between right and wrong. It grinds everyone mercilessly. That the most important thing in any circumstances is simply to survive, to keep breathing, not to lose humanity. 3 armies, 3 uniforms, 3 wars, and only one life. The life of a simple man who wanted only one thing: to live. In our increasingly divided world, the story of Yang Kyoungjong sounds especially relevant. It reminds us of the cost of conflicts, of the absurdity of war, of the fact that ordinary people have always been and remain the first victims of great empires and their ambitions. His grave in Illinois is now a place where people from around the world come to pay tribute to a man who became the living embodiment of 20th century tragedy. Koreans come to honor a compatriot, Russians to remember war victims, Germans to acknowledge their terrible history, Americans to remember the value of peace. On his grave lie flowers brought by people of different nationalities. Nearby is a small plaque with his biography in Korean, Russian, German, and English. 4 languages for a man who heard commands in all these languages, but whose native language remained forever Korean. The story of Yang Kyoungjong is more than one man's story. It is about how ordinary people become hostages of historical events, how war turns people into pawns, how the strength of human spirit allows survival even in impossible circumstances. Yang Kyoungjong experienced what no person should experience. He saw the worst humanity can offer. But he survived. And his story continues to live, reminding us of the past and warning us about the future. If someone had written a film script based on Yang's life, producers would have rejected it as too implausible. A man who served in 3 armies, fought on different sides, was captured 3 times. It seems too incredible to be true. But it is true. We live in a world where nationalist sentiments rise again, where conflicts emerge again, where calls for war sound again. Yang Kyoungjong's story should remind us where this leads. To suffering of ordinary people, to destroyed lives, to tragedies that could have been avoided. Yang was not a hero in the traditional sense. He did not perform feats, did not save comrades, did not receive medals. His heroism was different, the heroism of survival, of a man who refused to give up no matter what. His story teaches us that in any circumstances, no matter how terrible, a person can preserve the main thing: the desire to live, humanity, hope for a better future. When we look at that famous photograph, at the emaciated face of a young Korean in a German uniform, we must remember, this is not just a historical image. This is a reminder of the cost of war, of the value of peace, of the fact that every life matters, every story deserves to be told. Yang Kyoungjong went through the hell of 3 wars and survived to live the rest of his life in peace. His greatest victory was not that he survived 3 armies. His greatest victory was that he remained human. Eternal memory to the soldier of 3 armies, a man of one destiny.